Okay, then let's briefly introduce this concept of the user story, and at the end we will also briefly talk about another concept that is closely related to the user story. It's called the agile method of developing something. I'm sure you've heard of that before. So agile is a topic that goes beyond the topic of IT or developing products in general. But we will briefly look at what that means in the context of developing, so for example, a prototype in the course of this module. So the user story is a very simple thing to understand. So it's not a complicated concept. And we will use it to define the requirements for our product. And I will call that product because we will be building something in this module, and it will not only be software, it will also involve hardware. So we can call the whole thing simply a product. And so what we usually do is when we create or develop a new product, we need something that we call a requirement specification, or a specification of the product that gives some information about what the product should do or what the functionality of that product is. And so there are different ways how to do that. You could write a document where you have a certain structure describing these requirements, and then you could detail all these requirements and write down exactly what it should do and what it shouldn't do and how it should behave and what the user can do with it. So that's sometimes the way we do it, and we will learn later why maybe that's not the best idea. And we will learn here a different approach to developing products, especially when we develop new products and we have uncertainty about what the product will look like in the end. So first of all, what is it that we describe about a product? And we distinguish, especially in IT, again, here we distinguish between so-called functional requirements and non-functional requirements. So these are two distinct groups of types of requirements that we can describe. And in our context, we will be mainly talking about the left, the functional requirements. So the non-functional requirements, we will look at some examples and we'll try to understand what it is, but we won't be focusing on that. So the functional requirements are what functionality must the product offer. So we will look at examples, but it's really about what the user can do with this product. What functions does it have? And on the other hand, the non-functional specification or requirements are what are the circumstances and maybe constraints so in which circumstances and constraints should the product be operating in or work in. And that might be a little abstract. That's why we look at examples now. And this is examples for a web shop. So if you have an e-commerce solution and you want to describe some of the functional and some of the non-functional requirements. On the left side, we see the functional requirements, 3 examples. So we want to be able to search for products. So for example, we want to type something into a search field and then get a list of search results. So that's a very functional description of what the product, the e-commerce solution should be able to do. So we want to add products to our shopping cart. So when we decide this one looks nice, then we want to add it to our shopping cart. There must be the functionality to do that. It could be a button, but of course we also need the functionality of the shopping cart itself to be able to manage that shopping cart, remove items. But here it's just about adding products. And maybe when we have placed some orders, we want to be able to view the order status as well. So has it been processed yet? Is it currently being delivered, or is it already delivered? And who did it get delivered to? So that's functional descriptions for an e-commerce solution. And on the other hand, non-functional, we could mean something like, okay, the whole shop should be mobile ready. It should be viewable on a mobile device. That's not really a functionality, but it's rather a circumstance. So we want to be able to use a mobile device to use that shop. it should be able to work offline. So that's maybe not something that is easily implementable for an e-commerce shop, but for example, for word processing, like Google Docs, there you want to have an offline mode. For example, when you're on the train, you might not want to have an internet connection in order to work on your documents, but rather you want to be able to have an offline copy and then synchronize with the online world once you are online again. So that would be something more or less a non-functional requirement, because it's not really a function, it's rather a circumstance or a context or a constraint on how your product should operate. And then often it's about response times. So when the shop is too slow, people would say, oh, that's not usable, that's too slow, I rather go to a different shop. So we could say a non-functional requirement would be that our shop loads in less than 2 seconds. So users should see a result in under 2 seconds. That's also not a functional requirement. It's a non-functional requirement because it describes the circumstances of in which the functions should be operating. So that's a broad differentiation of these two types. And as I said, we'll be mainly looking at the functional requirements in the upcoming and so in our prototypes, in our products that we're building. So the user story then, what is it? It's the user story basically is a way to describe a functionality. So it's for the functional requirements, to describe functional requirements. And the question is how could we best describe functional requirements in a sense that it's easy, that it's especially easy to come up with. So if we think about how requirements for a complex product are generated or gathered, well, that's usually by asking people who are going to be using the product what they need, what their needs are, what are their problems. So what should the product, what functionality should the product offer so the problems can be addressed? And therefore you need the customer, and therefore you need maybe not just customers, but different types of users that will be using our product. There may be not only just one group of people who will be using our product. So for example, if we have an e-commerce shop, we might have the customer, we might also have suppliers, but we also have people working in the back end who work with the system. So there are at least 3 different roles involved. So the user story tries to offer a very easy way to describe a functionality. And this is basically what we see on this little sticky note here. And this is also how you can imagine it when we would meet and have a meeting with potential users of our product. We could give everyone small cards and they should write down a short sentence. And the short sentence should always be following this template. And it's basically, as my role, so whatever I am in the context of this product, so I could be a customer. So as a customer, I want to do something, or I want something from the system. So we express a goal or a desire, basically what I want the system or the product to do for me. And then the third part seems a little maybe redundant, but it's very important. So I express the benefit that I get from it. So it's so that I can X, Y. And we'll look at examples in a second. But this is basically a very simple template that we will use and that we can use. It's called the user story to describe functionality. And then we already have a distinction in different roles. So if I have more than one user group, I can simply sort these user stories by role, and then already have a distinction into my different types of users that we're using my product. Okay, let's look at an example from the web shop again. So this would be an example for a user story for an e-commerce shop. So as a customer, I want to be able to search for products so that I can get a quick overview of my options and make a buying decision. So that's a very simple sentence, easy to understand for anyone, and it follows the template that we've just seen. So why do I put down these so first of all, why do people care why I want that? So basically, it wouldn't be necessary. So it would be enough to say, as a customer, I want to be able to search for products. But often, when you know the intention why somebody wants to do or have a certain functionality, then you can, from that, get a deeper understanding of how this functionality must look like. Because the intention gives you more details. For example, in this case, if you only knew I want to be able to search for products, but you don't know why the user wants to do that or the customer wants to do that, it wouldn't be clear that you, for example, also would have to generate an overview and a good overview, so you can easily grasp the search results and maybe even offer sorting or filter on these search results, because you know that the user wants to use the search to get an overview of the options. And that already gives you a hint about how the feature or the functionality must look like to satisfy the customer. And this is why we also express this benefit, why we want something. And sometimes it's even just simple questions. So is it even necessary? Or is it maybe even another functionality that's already doing exactly that? So we can remove redundancies in our functionality as well, if we know why people want that. Or maybe we can combine different user stories into one if we know they have the same benefit or the same intention, but just expressed differently. So in our case, when we have, so this is for typical role is some user, some human who's interacting with our system. But in our case, we also have a lot of functionality that doesn't necessarily involve a human. So then we can tweak this template a little bit and write it as this. So this would be a non-human user story describing a functionality of a system where no human is involved. So for example, we could more generally say, if or when a certain trigger occurs, then do something. And then again, so that, why should it do that? So what's the benefit? And then this is a way how we can express a user story in the context of a more technical system, like a cyber physical system, where there's actually sometimes no human involved. And when we build products with IoT or hardware devices, there will be processes or functionalities that run without any human interaction. And there's an example here. So for example, when the temperature exceeds 30 degrees Celsius, so that's the trigger, then turn the AC on. And then the question is why? So that the temperature decreases again. So we want to lower the temperature. So that's, in this case, I think very obvious, but not in all cases. So that can also be, so this benefit can be more useful than in this user story. So that would be an example how we could write down or define a functionality in a non-user environment. So where we have a technical system that has some trigger and then does something, and more general, it's trigger, action, and then why is the action important? So what's the benefit? And then maybe we have the same system and it has a second story, which is this one. When the temperature falls below 20 degrees Celsius and the AC is currently on, so now we have basically it's a combined trigger which involves two different conditions. Then turn the AC off. So why? What's the benefit? So it doesn't get any colder. So we don't want to go colder than 20 degrees, for example, in this case. And this would be a description of a simple system that simply measures the temperature and then turns AC on or off depending on the temperature. It's a very simple example, but I think it shows the point how we can use the user story in our less human interaction context. But this doesn't mean that we will not have any human interaction, but because we will also have a user interface using a website where we can have a human being do something. So for example, I think Dennis told me he wants to build something with NFC where you have a profile stored on your NFC card, and then the user will hold the NFC card in front of the reader, and the reader then will identify that person based on the information that is stored on that card. So there's of course a user involved. So you will have user stories, but you will also have stories that don't involve a user. So we will actually have both. And that's why we look at both templates here. So important properties of the user stories from a content perspective. So first of all, the user story describes the what and not the how. So that simply means don't describe the technical solution to this functionality. So it doesn't say, for example, turn the AC on by sending the following command to the AC device and blah, blah, blah. So the whole technical solution is not part of the user story. It's just about what should happen. So what's the functionality? And the technical part is left to the developers, to those who build the product, to the engineers. So they need to decide, okay, so the user wants that. What is the best way to technically implement that and build the product so that it actually behaves in the way the user wants? So we do not say anything about the how in the user story. That's the first point. Then the user story always describes an interaction with the product from the perspective of a role. So that would be the user, the human centered user story. If we have a technical user story that has a trigger, then it describes some action that happens in the system based on a trigger. So that's only for the human-centered user story. The user story should only be one sentence at first, so it should be short. So the sentence, of course, can be a little longer, but it should be as precise and short as possible, because we want to add the details later on, or we can add the details later on. So at the first, it should really be very simple so that you can put it on one card, and in the best case, just put it on a wall and stick it, make it sticky and have people read it very fast. So you get an idea, a very quick idea of what the product should do in the end. And later on, we might be able, or we might even split one user story into more, so into two or even more. If it's a complex user story, we can maybe divide the whole functionality into different user stories. But that's also something that we can do later on once we have collected a set of user stories for our product. And then we will, once we get into working mode, we will see that maybe some of the user stories are too complex and we need to break them down. And then we can do that by simply splitting them into more than one user story. So now, what's the point of ZenKit that we'll be introducing in a second? So basically, very generally, we often use this type of board that you see here to handle the user stories. And the idea is that we describe these user stories, and these user stories basically are tasks for us, because someone will need to implement these user stories. So for example, the search functionality in a web shop. This could be something that a developer or an engineer can take from the board, looks at it and says, okay, I understand what it is. If it doesn't, so if it's not clear, then the user or the developer or the engineer can ask questions back to whoever wrote this user story to get more details. That's what I mean by we can detail it later. And once it's very clear, then the person will start to work on that user story, and it will move from open. So basically all user stories are open in the beginning. It will move from open to work in progress. Basically, it's currently being worked on. And then you simply move it in the physical world from one swim lane to the next. And then you have a third one, at least, that says when a user story is done, then you put it there. And this is just the outline of such a board that we could use. And we will use such a board. And for that, we will be using ZenKit. It will be very simple. We also have these 3 swim lanes open, work in progress, and done. And each group will have the ability to simply define their user stories here and then move these user stories around in those different swim lanes, which ultimately are different statuses of this user story.